For some reason, when it comes to understanding our companies, understanding ourselves, right, we don't apply that same methodology. Right? But there is actually one kind of organization, at least in the US that I'm familiar with, that does apply this very data-driven methodology to building their organization. Okay? And it's baseball teams. Okay? And for those of you who are familiar with baseball, since we are in the UK, it's basically a cricket with completely different rules, and they get paid more. So that's basically what it is. You know, and baseball's very interesting. Baseball's been around in the U.S. since the 1850s, and pretty much for first 150 years of this sport, the way you built a baseball team is you got a bunch of old guys who knew a lot about baseball, watched people play baseball, and then based on their subjective evaluations, they'd build a team, right? And sometimes they were right and sometimes they were wrong, but that was viewed as the best way to do things, okay? And they do that until 2001, still doing it that way. And then in 2002, you get Billy Beane or Brad Pitt, if you like, right? Who basically said, no. What we're going to do is we're actually going to use data to build our organization. In the case of baseball teams, this behavioral data, it's batting data, it's fielding data, but fundamentally it's data about behavior. And everybody thought they were crazy. They had a third the payroll of the biggest teams, the New York Yankees, the Boston Red Sox. So how could they compete? But they went on a record winning streak. They made the playoffs, and now every single team builds their organization this way. And so the question is, could you do the same sort of thing for business, right? And I believe when we take this data-driven perspective, we get a lot of, an interesting answer to some common problems that are facing all businesses today. Right? So a simple question, why is organizational change hard? And that might seem like a silly question. Mergers and acquisitions, restructuring, those things are just hard. But these are things that we do year after year. You get a lot of smart people working on them, and they're consistently failing. And so you could just throw up your hands and say, this is hard. M&A wastes about $1.2 trillion in market value a year. So you could say, we're going to throw $1 trillion every year in the wood chipper, and we're just going to forget about it. Right? Or you could say, maybe we're looking at the wrong metrics. Because the stuff we look at, we tend to look at that stuff on the left. We tend to look at org charts, formal processes, because they're easy to understand. Because I can point to the guy at the top of that org chart and say that's the most important person. It's not more difficult for me to look at that stuff on the right over there, right? For me to say, who's the social center of the organization? What's the culture of the company? The way we traditionally try to get at that stuff is we use surveys or human observers, but we know the problems with those things. First of all, with human observers, if I want to observe 1 million people at a time, I can't do it. And with surveys, if it's a sunny day out, you answer differently than it's a cloudy day out. And fundamentally, surveys measure perception. Right? And even if I believe that data, I actually don't know how to change it. Okay. So then the question is, well, how could you measure this stuff? Is there a way to objectively understand this, not just in the digital world as we were talking about before, but also in the physical world? Now, actually, I want you to think about what sort of data generation tools we're carrying around with us right now and every day. There's really two things. There's our cell phones and there's our ID badges. Right? And our company ID badges are actually very sophisticated sensors. And they can do an awful lot of things. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what they can do just right now. So first, to give you a sense for what sort of data you're generating, let's go through a regular day at work. Okay? So maybe you go through a regular day, you come in, you have a meeting, right? Then you'll maybe go at your desk, you'll bang out a few emails, right? And then you'll go have coffee with some coworkers. But what you're actually doing is you're not just having those conversations. What you're doing is you're generating data. So when you're having a meeting, you're not just having a meeting, you're actually generating information on how dominant you are. How much of the time do you talk? And this is important because if we're trying to come up with new ideas, if there's 4 of us, and I talk 90% of the time, we're coming up with my ideas. They're not going to be very good ideas, actually. Right? And there's decades of social science research on this. Right? But we can actually start to measure this in real time. But not even just if you're talking or not, we can start to look at what the flow of the conversation is. So who talks after who? Right? Is the conversation flowing through me, or are we going back and forth in more egalitarian fashion? And then even on top of that, not just am I talking or not, but how long do I talk for? So do I talk for little 5-minute little 1-minute segments, or do I go on for 20 minutes? It's more like a lecture. Again, those patterns indicate a lot about how effective a conversation is. And you can start to measure this in real time by just using a very simple microphone. And even when you're by yourself, you're generating a lot of very interesting information. So from your posture, actually you can see how you're leaning into your computer screen, or how we're leaning in during a conversation, and actually figure out how engaged you are in that conversation. I can look at how active you are over time. I can look at how much you're moving around, again, with an accelerometer, right? Just what's in your cell phone, right? A 99-cent sensor. So you can look at how much you're moving around, not only to see how energetic you are, but also it turns out that variance in these patterns is extremely important for looking at things like creativity. Of course, looking at all this digital data that we can collect, looking at your phone call data, email data, IM data, those things aren't just communication tools. So, one could argue that they're more valuable as data generation tools to actually help you probe the way that people are collaborating. Now, when you're in a conversation with someone, not just the fact that you're talking to them, but then you can do things like look at their tone of voice and actually understand how that affects the quality of the interaction. It turns out that I can actually predict about 61% of the variance in your cortisol levels by looking at changes in your tone of voice. Okay? Now, cortisol is essentially the gold standard for stress. So as you get more stressed, your cortisol level changes. Okay? And the way you actually assess that, the way we assessed that and first came up with this is working with some researchers out of Cornell. We had about a couple hundred people over the period of a few weeks. Literally every 15 minutes, they would spit into these tubes, okay? And at the same time, they're wearing badges. And then you send those tubes off to a lab, and then by analyzing cortisol levels, you can figure out to what degree they were stressed. It turns out, first of all, I thought that it would just be pretty stressful to every 15 minutes be spitting in a tube, but that's another discussion. But the point is we can actually predict that in real time just by looking at changes in your tone of voice. Okay. Then you can look at things like how quickly you're speaking, what's the volume modulation. So you're being really energetic when you're talking to somebody, or you're being a little bit more monotone and detached. And these are things that we can pick up on in real time. And so the idea is you think about these features, think about being able to collect this millisecond level data about everybody all the time. Okay? And of course, there's privacy implications there, and you have to think about those. But there's also this really fundamental potential for this to completely change the way we think about managing people, the way we think about what an organization is. And of course, this data gives you very, very detailed picture about what makes an effective person, what makes an effective employee, why do people stay at work. But then you can start to look at how do we put people together into teams. What's an optimal team? Could we prove that? Could we mathematically formulate that? Could we mathematically formulate how information is flowing across an organization? And what affects this? So this is very interesting. And one reason that we come at it from a sensing perspective is my group at MIT, we actually, where I got my PhD, we actually used to be the wearable computing group. Okay? So in the 90s, we were making these big wearable sensor vests with a big battery on the back that heated up a little bit too much. But over time we got better at that, and these things get smaller and cheaper and faster, and then we get to the size of something that's about the size of an ID badge. Right? And your normal company ID badge has a little RFID sensor in it. Right? RFID, that's a radio, that's a sensor. If you put little RFID readers all over a building, I can actually figure out where you are. But besides being a little creepy, right? That doesn't actually tell you how people are collaborating, how they're working. Right? To do that, what you need to understand is how who's talking to who, how are people talking to each other. And that's what all those things that I was showing you before, that's what this picks up on. In addition to things like location from Bluetooth, right? Figuring out where you are. Right? From infrared, figuring out who's facing who. The accelerometer picking up on your posture, picking up on motion. Right? And the microphone not recording what you say, but all those voice features I was talking about, calculating them in real time. So what I want to talk about is, I'm going to go through a few case studies of companies where we've actually deployed this technology. I'm going to show you what can you learn from it, and then we'll start to think about how it's going to, how this sort of technology, as it becomes more and more adopted, how it's going to change the way that people work. And the first example I'll talk about is actually a German bank. It's a big financial institution in Germany, and to give you a sense for what these people are working on, so we instrumented their entire headquarters. During the period of this 1 month that I'll show you, people are building a new mortgage product, okay? And what's interesting is I'll show you two things. I'm going to show you very simple metrics. How much are the different teams talking to each other face-to-face? How much are they emailing each other, okay? And we're just going to look at it and let's see how it changes over time, okay? All right. So basically, what you see here, emails on the bottom, it doesn't change very much day to day, right? It's pretty static. Face-to-face changes very drastically. Okay? It's pretty interesting. What's also interesting here, though, is that no one seems to like talking to customer service, right? I don't want to make any value judgments here, but it's interesting, right? Except, so it's going to restart. But what's interesting is, again, they're developing this new mortgage product, okay, and they actually roll it out on about the 18th. And it turns out they actually, because customer service wasn't talking to these guys, they didn't actually get to thoroughly check all the information they were handing out to customers. Turns out they had some incorrect information there, and you'll see right about, I think this next one, right there, okay? So, oops, right? And this is incredible, because basically when we show this to management, they're like, well, if we'd seen this before, we would have brought them in a lot sooner, right? But they just had no idea that this is going on. Right? Even something as simple as saying, does support talk to customer service? That's a dead simple question. The answer is no, right? But you couldn't even answer that. They had no idea it was happening. Okay? Now, as a corollary to that, actually customer service, one reason people didn't talk to them, and you'll see this come up again, they were on a different floor from all these other divisions. Okay? And you'll see this come up again and again and again. While technologically, while they were emailing them and everything like that, it didn't matter. It didn't have that same effect. Okay? And importantly, so after we found this company made a change where they integrated customer service into all these other divisions. Had a lot of success the next quarter. It was very nice. Okay, but what we're talking about here. I mean, this next quarter after they made these changes, sales went up by over 30%. It was a huge effect. Okay, but you might say, all right, well, first of all, it's not exactly scientific doing that, but also, these guys are coming up with financial products, right? I mean, this stuff should matter. Collaboration should matter. What about something where this is a very individual, very simple task? It shouldn't matter then, right? Okay, so let's think what kind of organization would really fit that bill? Okay. Maybe a place like a call center. Okay, I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a call center before, but it's not exactly the happiest place on earth, right? I mean, people yell at you all day for stuff that's not your fault. That's your job, right? And on top of that, call centers have really been managed one way since their inception. Right? What happens is that, if you're on a break, no one else on your team is on a break. Okay? The reason is that, in the 60s, you might have had 100 people on a call center. So if, 20 people took a break at the same time, you wouldn't be able to handle all the calls coming in. Of course, today we have thousands and thousands of call center employees. It no longer necessarily makes sense to do it that way, but we've just kept doing it that way. That's the way we're doing it. So again, here you're obviously rewarded based on individual performance, which is very much how long does it take you to complete calls with customers, right? And at the same time, it's something where it looks very individual. We're going to put badges on these people. We're going to actually mine out this data, and we're just going to see what are the things that relate to individual performance. And this is a project we did with Bank of America, and they're really interesting. They have call centers all across the U.S. Same formal organizational structure, same employee demographics, same training, very different performance. So it's something about the way these people are interacting that has an effect, but what is that? Okay. So let's just look at what happens. First, we're just going to look at the first month's worth of data. And basically what we saw was the people who had the most tight-knit face-to-face networks, so the people they talk a lot to each other, okay, those people were completing calls in half the time as people with the least cohesive networks. And it was a very straight, it was a linear effect. It was just straight down. Okay? It was pretty powerful. Because call centers are essentially managed to reduce that kind of interaction. Right? And the question is, well, when, and also you saw this reduced stress, which we can tell from your changing your tone of voice. Right? But also here we also got survey data to validate that. But then the real question is, when were people talking to each other? Because remember, your break, no one else on your team is on a break, right? But it turns out that occasionally, your lunch break overlaps by about 15 minutes with the people that you work with. Okay? That's when 80% of the interaction happened here. Okay? So we made a very simple change. We said, let's change when half of the teams in this call center take a break, and one of their call centers take a break. Okay? That's it. Just went from that to that. It costs the company nothing. It's very easy for them to shift the load to other teams. Okay? Then 3 months after we make this change, we look at the data again and say what happened. Okay? And this is what happened. Right? Cohesion and stress are also measured by the badge. Right? So cohesion went up by about 18%, which you'd expect, right? Because now you're on a break with the people you already talked to. You're going to talk to them more. Makes sense. Stress went down very significantly. Again, you'd expect that. Partially just because now, again, if I had a really tough call, early in the day, now I can complain to my coworkers, and that's going to be very effective. But also, now what we can do is, if I tell one of my friends, that I had a difficult call or something hard's going on at home, then if I have a more tight-knit network, then all my other friends are going to find out and they're going to be able to support me. That last number is really interesting, though, productivity. People are completing calls 23% more quickly. Importantly, for all of these metrics, there was no significant change in the groups where we didn't change their break structure. Okay, so that's very significant, right? Concretely. So first of all, theoretically, why might this happen? Well, it could happen because we're basically competing in terms of performance metrics, right? So if if I spend an hour with a customer trying to solve a problem, and I tell you how I did it, and then you solve that problem in 5 minutes, you're going to look much better in comparison to me. But if we're in a tight-knit group, then I know it's going to come back to me. Because if you hold out on me, then all our friends are going to find out, and then we're just going to cut you out. Okay? To give you a sense of the magnitude of this, okay, rolling this out across Bank of America, that saves them about $15 million a year, okay, for free, right? I mean, that costs nothing. That's a conservative estimate. What's interesting here is that if you go to a company and say, we're going to increase performance by 25%, the normal reaction is like, wow, we have to completely change the way we work. But what this sort of result is saying is that, if you can find those social levers that people are responsive to, and you can act on them in the right way, then you're going to get really big results. Okay. I'll go through one more example here. And this is in retail banking. And what we're just going to do here is I'm just going to show you some data. We went to a couple dozen branches. And again, they're organizationally exactly the same, but they have very different performance. So here what we're just doing is we're just looking at the social networks of these branches. So each dot here is a person, and the size of the line between people is how much they talk to each other. Okay? So we see 3 branches here. We see branch 1, where pretty much everybody is talking to each other. We got branch 2, where they're sort of split into 2 factions. And we've got branch 3, where there's those lonely guys on the outside. Maybe they don't shower. But it's interesting here, because if you look at this, actually, I'm going to tell you that one of these branches has 3 times the performance, 3 times the per capita sales as one of the other branches. Okay, these people sell small business loans. Okay, again, paid based on individual performance. So you're paid, based on how many of these loans you sell in any given month. Okay. Any guesses? So who thinks branch 1 has the highest performance? Okay, branch 2 and branch 3. Okay, pretty good. So branch 1 has the highest performance. Branch 3, by the way, was pretty close, but those 3 outliers had very, very low performance. Okay, branch 2 was by far the worst. Okay? So the question is, well, what was creating these dynamics? Okay? There's some very interesting things that are going on here, right? Because the point is, in branch 1 now, if someone learns how to pitch a certain type of client, pretty much everyone else in the branch is going to find out very quickly. Right? And one of the big reasons for this was actually it turns out that the manager of this branch had set up group performance targets, that if they hit a certain sales goal, everybody got a bonus. So they're incentivized to share. Right? And branch 2, we're trying to figure out, well, why are there these 2 factions here? Until we realize, and again, this is representative. There's actually a number of branches that were like this. The group on the left is the first floor, right's the second floor. Right? But importantly, to give you a sense for this is a retail location, right? The stairs, walking up those stairs takes literally 10 seconds. I timed it, okay? But people don't do that. They just will not walk up those stairs. So as a consequence, information is not flowing across these 2 floors. And even in something as seemingly individualistic as sales, right, that has a major effect, has a measurable effect. So you can bet that even if they're saving money on space now, like this bank does not look for new retail locations, right, that have 2 floors. Because even if they save money on space, it wouldn't be worth it. Okay. And for branch 3, again, trying to figure out what are these poor outliers that are out there. It turns out that those were all new employees. But they'd all been in the company for more than a month, and they were still only talking to their manager. Okay, so that's a problem. One way you deal with that is we basically gave their managers some money. And we said, take that employee out, take your new employees out to lunch with somebody else at the company. Right? The issue here is that core is way too cohesive to integrate new people. So basically, by creating an opportunity, by getting people to go out to lunch with each other, you start to create interactions between people. And the point is with this sort of data, I can actually tell you how much more money the company is going to make when those people eat lunch together. Right? So what that means is that even if you say we spent $100 sending those guys out to lunch, well, you actually probably made about $1,000 by doing that. Right? And you can put those hard metrics on these things. All right, so went through, and again, we've worked in dozens of companies, got some other ones. But I also wanted to talk about some of the perspectives that this kind of data gives us just on the way we work. And it was nice that Philip brought this up earlier, but one thing that I'm really interested in is remote work. And we talked about these guys, right? Now, when Marissa Mayer announced, I guess in I think it was February, that everybody at Yahoo had to come into the office, there was, lots of criticism was coming in that this isn't fair to women, this isn't fair to employees who expected that they were going to work in a company where they could work from home most of the time. But what I don't like is that in a lot of those arguments, people were using anecdotes or just personal theories about why it would work or not work. And I actually just want to look at the data. Okay? So the question is, what happens when people are remote, when they're co-located? How does that change the way they collaborate? How does that change outcomes? That's all I'm interested in. And to give you a sense, so I don't know if any of you here are programmers, probably a few of you. But I think there's a stereotypical view of programmers. By the way, I come from computer science, so I'm sort of biased. But people think of the stereotypical programmer is they're the person who sits in the corner drinking Mountain Dew and doesn't talk to anybody, right? You think it's a very individual task, but it's not. Programming is one of the most collaborative tasks out there because the code that you write depends on the code of hundreds or thousands of other people, right? So if I'm programmer 1, P1, and you're programmer 2, P2, if I write code X and you write code Y, and my code depends on your code, we need to talk to each other, right? So if we have a gap, it'll take us 32% longer to develop code. It's very significant. This isn't just work that we've done. This is work coming out of Carnegie Mellon, MIT, out of Stanford, all showing the exact same thing. So communication is very important. But the question here is that how do people who are remote, how does their collaboration patterns compare to people who are co-located? And let's not handicap them. Let's just look at digital communication. All right, we're just going to look at how they collaborate digitally. And I'm going to mine these dependencies out of a software development platform. So I know who works on what pieces of code. I know when they communicate about what piece of code. Okay, so I can build this network, right? And so basically what we did is work with IBM, went to a number of their development teams, and we just mined out all this data. And we just looked at how do co-located teams differ from people who are working remotely. And we're going to use a really, really low bar. If there's at least one communication about a dependency, we'll consider it fulfilled. Okay, so that's it. Okay? And here's what we saw. Okay? So basically, about 55% of the time, people who are co-located will communicate about a dependency, right? So 45% of the time, they don't. These numbers are essentially flipped when people are working remotely, okay? Now let's go to Yahoo for an example, right? So if we take these numbers to Yahoo, remember, so for the code, for that roughly 10% of code, that now has these gaps, right? It's going to take you 32% longer to develop it. Okay? How much is that worth? How much is that worth to Yahoo? Okay? That's worth $150 million a year. That's very significant. So essentially, by a stroke of a pen, they just made $150 million. It's good. It's a good investment. It's a good deal. Okay? And first of all, remember we used the most conservative definition we could. Right? We said if there's one communication, we'll consider it fulfilled. The question is, what was the quality of that communication? On average, people who were remote communicated about 8 times about a dependency. Okay? Whereas people who are co-located communicate on average, again, digitally, 38 times. Okay? So even though technologically I could contact anybody, and in this case, actually, there was more dependencies of people who were remote than there were who were co-located. So it's not like I needed to work with the people who are co-located more than the people who are remote. Okay? But the fact is that because I bumped into these people every day, because I saw them, I actually digitally communicated with them more. It's a major effect. And I think the point is that if Yahoo had come out and said, listen, this is worth $150 million to us, right? We cannot leave that kind of money on the table. The conversation would have been very different. Maybe you're willing to give away, $10 million worth of this, right? But that this is a very important thing to think about, right? And that you can put numbers on this stuff. And before you make a decision, whether it's to have people work remotely all the time, whether it's even to have people work, a couple days from home, the question is, what does it do to this? Right? And that's the question. And maybe you're willing to sacrifice someone on this performance, and that's fine. But you need to make that decision having all the information. Okay. What's really interesting, though, is it's not even just if you're remote or co-located. With this sort of data, we can start to really drill in on, how far away do you sit from people, and how does that relate to how much you talk to each other? Right? And trivially, this is pretty consistent across, I only put a few up here, but pretty much across every deployment we've done, between 40 and 60% of all your interaction happens with people who sit next to you. It's not surprising. But basically what happens, though, is that you can see once you get on a different floor, you basically don't talk to these people unless it's a meeting, right? You don't go to another floor just to get coffee, okay? Just to go to someone's coffee machine, right? And this just again shows that if one of the most powerful organizational tools you have is physical space, right? Is if I want to get groups to talk to each other, or if I put them next to each other, yeah, they're going to talk. But companies don't use this tool, right? They don't think of this as an organizational tool. They'll spend, months thinking about what the org chart looks like, and they might spend, the CEO might spend, a day or two thinking about this stuff, right? But the point is that actually, if you look at the data, only about 20% of interaction happens along formal hierarchical lines. So you're spending that much time managing that stuff. And this is a very simple lever where I change where you sit, and it changes all this stuff. Again, stuff that a lot of people intuitively understand, but you can start to put some really hard numbers on what this actually means for an organization. Okay. All right. The last thing that I'll talk about here is really a lot of the work that's starting to be done in our society today is getting more and more complex. Right? And as an example, I'm going to use Boeing. Okay. So in 1971, Boeing designed the 747. Okay. And what's amazing about this project is from the start of design until they manufactured it, took 16 months, okay? Which is incredible. It's incredible to go from nothing to starting to manufacture a plane in 16 months. It's amazing. Okay? Now let's go fast forward to 2006. Okay, Boeing is designing the 787. Okay, and it's orders of magnitude more complex. It has composite materials, right? It's got thousands of computer systems. It's got next generation engines. It's a very complex piece of machinery, right? But of course, technology has gotten a lot better over that time, right? Comparing 71 and 2006 is like night and day from a technological perspective, right? But of course, I think most of us know what happened here. It took them 6 years and cost them $32 billion, and they're still having all these problems with 787, right? And this is amazing, right? Because you think about this. Here's the issue: we can get along with this. Like this is terrible. But Boeing can afford to make this investment. In about 15 years, they'll end up recouping their investment, and they'll start making some money. Okay? But the question is, what's next? Right? So let's fast forward another 40 years. Right? If Boeing's going to make their next plane, is it going to take them 20 years and cost $300 billion? No, it will though, right? It's not sustainable. The issue is that the complexity of these projects has gone up exponentially, right? And the coordination required to execute those projects has gone up, it's sort of geometrically as well, right? And the issue is you can no longer have a person or a team of people keep all these dependencies in mind. So I can't sit down at the beginning of a project and say, this team needs to talk to that team and all these things happen. You're going to cover the major dependencies, and that's what happens. But if you look at the 787, for example, right, when they've had these failures, they're in these minor systems. Like one of them was in the auxiliary battery unit for the bathroom, okay? Like it's not a major thing, but that those are the things that fall through the cracks. And that's going to continue to happen and make these things intractable. And so the issue is that as a society, we're running up against some fundamental limits, not of technology, but of how we organize people. And what that means is that we need to have computational tools that help us manage the way we actually collaborate. Right? And that without that, we're not going to be able to build that next airplane. We're not going to get to that next level because we're going to be stuck in all these other things. Right? And the point is that by using data, by using all these things we have at our disposal, we can start to implement that. Okay. And so now to wrap up, a lot of what I've been talking about is how you can leverage data from across massive organizations and aggregate them to get these really interesting understandings about what makes people effective. And of course, this applies, to big companies, and that's a lot of who we've been working with. They're larger organizations, But you can start to think about how this would apply to things like small business, right? And small business is interesting. Small businesses fail about 70% of the time within 3 years. And the big reason isn't because they don't have good ideas. It's because they've never run a business before. Right? But what if you could essentially buy management in a box, right? Where I'm opening a restaurant, and maybe I'm a good cook, but I have no idea how to train my wait staff. So what if I could actually see, how does the wait staff at the best restaurant in the city, how do they actually talk to their customers? How do they talk to each other? How do they talk to the line cooks? Right? Could I actually measure that? Could I give feedback to my employees and then iterate on that? But not just maybe from other restaurants. Maybe it actually turns out that there's this grocery store in Africa doing something organizationally very interesting. Could I actually quantify that and understand that best practice and then apply it in my organization? And then not just thinking about these small businesses learning from each other, but thinking about the things that they're doing here, actually applying to these big businesses, and actually having these best practices spread not at the speed, the clock speed where we have 10 years after something happens, someone writes an HBR case study on it, right? But actually having something happen where literally next week we're going to see what are all the best things that are happening this week, and we can actually start playing with those, start understanding what they are, and start implementing them. And I think that's really one of these things that's going to rapidly change how quickly we can innovate and really how we manage people. So at last, I'll do a plug for my book, which makes a great holiday present. You should buy multiple copies. But unfortunately, I have to get going a little bit after this. So if you have any questions or anything, I don't know if we have time, but otherwise, just feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to answer it. But thanks very much for listening.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Ben. Do take him up on that offer. We've got time for a few questions. Very, very interesting. I was particularly interested in the retail bank, 2 floors, 2 factions, productivity plummets. How often have we seen that? Right, who would like to ask a question of Ben? Yeah? Down the front. Just hang on, just wait for the mic, and if you could say who you are and where you're from.
Hi, my name's Kevin Eva Norton. I'm an independent consultant from Switzerland. Mm-hmm. And my question is, to run these projects, how did you get the permission to do that, the data privacy question?
Sure. So there's 2 things. So first of all, there's where the technology is going, right? So I've got mine. I couldn't wear it because of the mic. But basically where this is going is this is just becoming companies' ID cards. Right? And within 5 years, whether it's us or somebody else, every single ID card is going to have these sensors in it. And so we're starting to actually deploy them continuously. But importantly, the way we do it is you don't just come in and say, you're wearing this, right? No one would want to do it. I wouldn't want to do it. Right? So first of all, we do this on an opt-in basis. So if someone doesn't want to participate, we actually give them dummy badges that look the same. They just don't collect data. But we've gotten over 90% participation in every single roll that we've done. And a big part of that is because 4 weeks before we actually start rolling it out, we give a presentation actually very similar to this. We say, this is what we do with the data. Companies don't get access to individual data. So you actually can't see, what is Bob doing? You can't see that, right? Because there's actually not a very good business case for that. And we think about all the abuses that could come from that. There's a lot. So that's actually in our contract with our clients. When we actually do this opt-in procedure, we give people consent forms, which have the database tables of what data we collect. Right? So we say, this is what we're collecting. Your name is stored with the database. We won't give this individual data to your employer. We sign it. The participants sign it. Right? After a certain period of time, we actually even pull out any identifiers. We don't even have your name, but we pull out other identifiers as well. So companies get access to aggregate statistics. Right? But things like we're not recording what you say. We're not counting how many times you go to the bathroom. Once you really show what we can do with it, and that the idea is to really show the value of collaboration at work and really how to make your work a better place to be, I think that makes it really compelling for people, and we've gotten really good buy-in up to this point. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
There's one right there.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tom Ball from Neardesk. Just wondering what you'd seen good and bad from hot desking.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Actually, I'm trying to think. I don't know how much data we actually have from those sort of situations. I mean, I think it's an interesting model. I don't like saying things where I don't have data about it. So we need to collect data. If you have some potential site, I'd be happy to collect some data on it. But I'm going to refrain from commenting on it. Otherwise, I'll sort of have torpedo my whole presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
One more?
Yeah, one more question. Just gentleman there.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stephen Lambert from MCS. You talked a lot about people interaction, social interaction, and how people talk. A lot of people here in the room, I imagine, are interested in also in the physical location of those people when that happens. You mentioned Bluetooth. I mean, there's many other technologies out there. Some are harder to implement than others. Which ones are you looking into to make it more predominant as a way to measure that?
Sure. And so there's a whole process by which we decided on Bluetooth. And there's a few good reasons for that. So there was stuff like RFID. RFID is not great because you have really limited range that you can actually sense. Like, I'd need to put a ton of sensors up here. There's different kinds of longer range radios like Wi-Fi and some other protocols. They're really power intensive. Like, if I just had a device that its only job was to be a Wi-Fi beacon, and I actually had sensors in the environment that were sucking up that data, it could be okay. But just location by itself, actually, if in terms of we look at what predicts performance, for example, or retention, any of these things, proximity was never enough, or location was never enough, right? And that's not to say there aren't applications where that data isn't very necessary, but the power consumption issues of that were pretty huge. Bluetooth, on the other hand, you can use very low power Bluetooth where you still get 10 meter range. You can get 100 meter range, but again, the power issues come up as well. So be happy to talk about that. There's a lot of other technologies that are potentially out there, but we did a lot of work figuring out which one was going to work best, and Bluetooth is pretty good. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's in a way, it's a bit like the quantified self movement, moving into the workplace, the Nike Fuel Band, and people, it's a generational thing. Some people want to be wired up, some people don't.
Yeah.
Is there anything demographic going on there? Is it a younger cohort that's more willing to be monitored and measured?
Sure. So what I'd say is what we've seen in terms of participation rates, again, we've gotten very high participation rates. That being said, it's a lot easier to roll out in two types of organizations. One's people like technology. Obviously, it's easier to roll it out. Yeah. It's not necessarily a younger or older thing that we've seen, at least, but it's also been basically in organizations that have pretty poisonous cultures. Like, this doesn't fix everything, right? So, there's this one company in particular I'm thinking of. It's a big Fortune 500 company, and I mean, I want to say 3/4 of the workforce hated working there, right? And so,
a Fortune 500 company with a poisonous workforce. That doesn't narrow it much.
We work with a lot of Fortune 500s, and this one was particularly bad. And actually, I can tell you something. Well, hopefully this won't give it away. But at their headquarters, okay, this was amazing to me. So at their headquarters, one of the reasons they wanted us to deploy there was that they had no idea what was going on in the front lines, right? No idea. And so, so we're like, okay, well, I want to figure out where we're going to deploy these. So where do these guys sit? They're like, okay, so we're in the headquarters building. They're like, oh yeah, okay, they're on the first floor. So, okay, yeah, and where's the guys who they report to? Where's their managers so that we can figure out, what are the best people to go to there? Like, oh, and they're on the second floor. I'm like, wait. So basically, if you took the org chart and you layered it on the building, literally the floor you were on was what level in the hierarchy you were in. Right? So basically, if you go to deploy at a place like that, right, what happens is that everyone's like, well, management is out to get me, and everything they do is just to make my life miserable, right? So it took us 8 weeks to roll out there. We got it done, but that's a lot harder, right? It's a lot harder.
You've answered the question.
Yeah.
Ben Weber, thank you very much
everybody.
Thank you.